Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode of our show is called What Have We Learned from the War with Iran? And what advantages have we gained? Our guests for the show are Shackley Raffetto, retired judge of the Second Circuit of Hawaii, and Michael Lilly. He's a practicing lawyer, but he was Attorney General of the state. They're both retired from the military. Now that things are relatively quiet, and I say relatively, at least for a while in the war with Iran, we should take stock and evaluate what we have learned or not from the conduct of that war. So set the stage. Shackley Raffetto will give us a little background here and introduce the scope of our show. Shackley?
Okay, thank you, Jay. I just thought a little bit of background might be helpful, and then we can get on to maybe the points that we've learned. Well, this is a war between, a short war so far between Israel and Iran. Israel is about 11 million people, and Iran is about 92 million people. So it's a case of a small nation taking on a very big nation, which I think holds implications for the Iran or the Ukraine-Russia war, which is kind of similar in that regard. It's interesting to know that, Israel was founded in 1948, as we know, and its military is made up of about 125,000 active duty with about 530,000 reservists available. So they're heavily reserve dependent. Every male and woman, with a few exceptions like mothers and so on, are conscripted in Israel. Men serve for 32 months and women serve for 24 months, and then they must be in the reserves until age 40, which is very interesting. It's different than what we have. The war started with Israel's attack on June 13th, went for about 12 days. It's interesting, the distance between Jerusalem and Tehran is just short of 1,000 miles. So it's a long way from Israel to Iran to conduct an air war with fighter jets and attack jets. Israel has about 260 of these types of aircraft with 7 aerial refueling tankers, which were used extensively. They also have 5 SIGINT, intelligence aircraft, some Gulfstreams. Israel has F-16s, F-35s, and F-15s, all very new American hardware, many of which have been adapted by the Israelis. And one adaptation is they've added additional fuel tanks because of the necessity to engage in aerial combat with faraway nations. As far as Iran is concerned, this is interesting. I mentioned there were 92 million people in Japan or in Iran. Under 14 is 20 million. 22% of the population is under 14 years of age, and under 15 to 64 is about 70%, 64 million. Ethnically, Persians are 61%, Azerbaijanis are 16%. Persians and the Azerbaijanis are mostly in control of the country. Kurds are 10%, and Baluchis are 2%, and then there are other smaller percentages for Arabs and Turkmen and so on. The primary adversaries of the regime have been the Kurds and the Baluchis. Religion-wise, 89% are Shia Muslims, 10% are Sunni Muslims, and the rest are Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews. The government of Iran is run by a 290-person parliament, which passes the laws, but it's subject to control by what's called the Guardian Council, which is a group of 12 clerics who can set aside any laws that are passed by the parliament, and their job is to make sure that any laws that are passed and go into effect conform with Islamic laws. And over all of that is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and he basically runs everything and control everything. And of course, it's an Islamic regime which enforces Sharia law upon the population. The current Islamic Republic was founded in 1979 when the first Ayatollah overthrew the Shah of Iran. The current Ayatollah took office in 1989 and has been in office ever since. Militarily, Iran has about 420,000 regular military, but there is also a military force called the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that's kind of like the SS in Nazi Germany. Their job is to protect and ensure the ideological purity of the regime and protect the Ayatollah and the clerics. Part of the IRGC has a group called the Quds Force. The Quds Force, their job is to handle external operations of the IRGC and the Islamic regime. That is, they liaison with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the other terrorist organizations that Iran supports outside of the country. Let's see, I mentioned the Ayatollah was in control since 1979 when the Islamic Revolution occurred. Before that, the country was run by the Shah Pahlavi, who had been in place until right after World War II. Interestingly, his father was in charge of the country until World War II, but he apparently was a Nazi sympathizer. So the British and the Americans and the Russians got rid of him and put the subsequent Shah, who was later overthrown, into power. And he was kind of a moderate. He tried to modernize Iran, but he had a group of communists and the religious extremists opposing him, and he tried to balance those two off. And he was a bit heavy-handed, of course, from the way he treated people. So there was unrest. Eventually, the Ayatollah was actually convicted and sentenced to death, but the Shah commuted his sentence, and the Ayatollah went up to live in Iraq for 14 years until they came back and overthrew the Shah, which is interesting. Let's see. There was as I mentioned, the opposition are basically the Kurds and the Baluch, which make up about 11 million people. There was a 2023 survey, apparently, of the Iranian people. 81% rejected Islamic control and wanted democracy. I don't know what the details were on that survey, but that's pretty significant. Their Air Force is about 400. It's very old U.S. and Russian equipment, F-4s, F-5s, old F-14s, and most of that was destroyed by the Israelis during the recent operation. So that's a little bit of a background. I would say that the first issue the thing I think we've learned is that a smaller country can definitely take on and succeed against a larger population. And the reason I mention that is because I've heard a lot of commentators say, well, Iran has got more people, so it would always win, or Russia has got more people than the Ukrainians, so the Ukrainians are always going to lose. And I think this is pointed in the direction that that's not necessarily always true, and that's a good thing to know. And you take a highly highly trained and effective and modern military like the Israelis, they can punch above their weight, and they did here.
It's amazing that Ukraine has basically neutralized the Black Sea fleet of the Russian. Ukraine has no navy, and the premier, one of the premier navies in the world, the Russian Navy, is neutralized by Ukraine because of the use of those sea-going, water-going drones. So size doesn't necessarily mean anything in this environment. In terms of outcomes and lessons learned, one of my favorite historians, I greatly respect, Victor Davis Hanson, he said not long ago, last week, that the outcome of this war between Israel and Iran will be for naught, unless one, they eliminate the nuclear threat of Iran and they remove the regime. Well, apparently we succeeded in destroying their nuclear weapons systems, at least for now. But unlike some of our other journeys in Iraq and Libya and other places, the attack on Iran by the U.S. was not targeted for regime change, although there may be people that want it within the military establishment. And I even heard Trump indicate some sympathies to that. But the attack was primarily a military targeted attack, not for regime change, but for a specific military outcome, and that was a neutralization of their nuclear weapon capability. And as I say, that's pretty much been achieved. But the regime still is in power. So, what are the implications, and how does that change? Our experience has been with Saddam, with Gaddafi, for Milosevic, that we can't change regimes by air power alone. It's just impossible, and we're just not good at that anyway. But we're certainly not going to put boots on the ground. That's been very clear by the administration. So the fact that the regime is still in power, how will that be deposed, or how's that going to play out? There's probably only two ways that they can be deposed. One is going to be a revolution of the people, which hasn't happened, or a coup. A coup, Shackley was talking about the military in Iran. Iran's military is not primarily designed as an offensive weapon to go outside of its boundaries and fight an enemy. It's basically there to subjugate the people of Iran. So Israel apparently has destroyed all of its major leaders, and I wonder how the next group of leaders coming up, how they're viewing their longevity in this environment if anything gets hot again. But there's no indication yet of a coup. But I want to talk about the people. Shackley had an interesting survey there about the number of people that basically didn't favor the Islamist religion in the country. I was watching a video of former Saudi Arabia ambassador Charles Freeman, and he was claiming if we go in there and we fight Iran, we're going to have 80% of the people against us. And I talked with an Iranian friend of mine that I talk with frequently about Iran and our relations, and he has a whole different take. He said maybe 10% of the people, maybe 20 at the most, support the regime, and those are all people that get a benefit from it. So they're there for their own self-interest. So if their self-interest disappears, their sport's going to disappear. But 80 to 90% of Iran is pro-America and want regime change. They want the regime brought down. And they've told me several times that they think Iran could go the way of Syria in weeks, days, months. It's going to happen because the people are so much against it. But the country has to rise up. The Shah's son has called for the people to rise up against the regime. And my friend also indicated that Israel's biggest mistake was not killing Khomeini, and that if they had killed him, there might have been a greater likelihood that there'd be a regime change. But I'm not certain about that. Iran is a theocracy, as Shackley laid out, and there's a huge cadre of mullahs under the Ayatollah, and if the Ayatollah goes away, there's a replacement that's going to step in. So just killing the Ayatollah is not going to have any major change in the regime. On a different subject, the implications of what's happened, I think, are worldwide. They affect the whole world. They certainly affect the Middle East deeply. Iran has fairly much been neutralized. The Houthis have been somewhat neutralized. Hamas is pretty much decimated. Hezbollah. Syria was a close ally of Iran. They're gone. Russia no longer has a presence there. Russia's got its hands full. China doesn't want to have has no interest in going into the Middle East. Their focus is primarily on Taiwan, and there's been some concern if that our being so involved in the Middle East might give impetus to Xi Jinping to go into Taiwan. But it was masterful that we're only involved in it for a day, and they've got a ceasefire, so everything is quiet on that front. The other implication, I've had people send me questions about whether we're facing World War III. Well, I say, with who? Who's the war going to be with? Who's it against? Russia's not going to get involved. They can't even beat Ukraine, so they're not going to open a front down in the Middle East. China, as I say, is not going to get involved. So I don't see a world war. I think the worst flash front is China and Taiwan as a potential future war. But I don't see the World War III happening under this environment. So it's the implications are worldwide, and I think right now everything is pretty quiet in the Middle East as long as the ceasefire holds.
On regime change, as I like to say, I always quote Chairman Mao, who said, "Power comes out of the barrel of a gun." And I don't, while the general population may be very much in favor of changing to a democracy, do they have the power to do that? You know, I know the IRGC, some of the leaders were killed, but there's 190,000 of them. That's a lot of people. Plus, there's also a Islamic militia, or a kind of reservists that they call for. It's probably the people who go around victimizing women who don't cover their heads. It's called the BASIJ, Basaj. So that's in addition to the IRGC and the Quds force that any regime change effort would have to deal with. And unless they're armed, I don't see how the general population could do that. Even if the Kurds and the other groups, are perhaps more militant than the general population. The other thing is, as Mike mentioned, Russia and China didn't come to the aid of Iran, and they were in alliances. China buys, I think, all their oil, or a great deal of it, and Russia actually has a mutual support agreement, and neither one of them came forward, which I thought was remarkable. So those alliances don't seem to be as strong as perhaps we thought they were when they were announced. I was surprised to see that. The other thing is, I was surprised to see how extensive their nuclear program was. I just thought about it in general terms before the Israelis started attacking it, and we had all these different locations pointed out, and the rather remarkable construction of particularly the one that they dropped the penetrator bombs on. That must have taken enormous amount of their economy. If you add that to what it must cost them to support Hezbollah and Hamas and these other organizations, poor Iranian people they're poor because of the ambitions of the Islamic government, and but you can imagine that must have been an enormous investment to build all those installations. The other thing I point out is I thought that the attack by the American B-2s has substantially enhanced the deterrence impact of the U.S. I think the Russians and the Chinese were looking at that. They have nothing in terms of that kind of capability of flying halfway around the world and launching a devastating attack. It seems to me that they're looking at that and they're thinking maybe the U.S. is a lot more determined and a lot more powerful than we thought. So I think that our deterrence factor has increased substantially as a result of this. I might just also point out that the B-2s are about to be succeeded. We have 3 B-21 Raiders that are in testing phase now that are supposed to be deployed maybe by 2027, which are even more effective than the B-2s. The other thing I would point out is I was impressed by the effectiveness of Mossad in infiltrating Iran and targeting the nuclear scientists and other army officials and so on that were taken out by the Israelis. And Mossad is just a fantastic intelligence organization and extremely effective. And they might be able to assist any effort for regime change, and it would probably require something like that in order to make it effective.
A couple of points on what you were pointing out, Shackley. You are right about the economy in Iran is in a shambles. The people are, in a poverty level. My friends and my Iranian friends tell me that they sell their topsoil to other countries.
Wow.
That's how poor people are. Can you imagine undermining your future, being able to grow things by selling your topsoil? On the Mossad, not just Mossad, but Israel's neutralization of the Iranian ability to even respond to a military attack was masterful. And they achieved, overnight, they achieved complete air superiority over a country 10 times its size, Israel's side. That alone was masterful, and it paved the way for us to bring in our B-52s. And it's not only the fact that we have this capability, these B-52s with these big bombs, and that we can fly so far and refuel in the air, but the military precision of carrying out that operation, just that alone is a lesson for our adversaries around the world. I'm certain that China is taking close attention to the fact that we could pull off such an incredibly intricate, difficult maneuver and have complete success. They dropped those bombs from 40,000 feet in the air right down into air shafts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just phenomenal.
What about the various steps of this operation? Number one is that bomb, the bunker buster, was designed for this very engagement, and it was the first time the bunker buster had been used. Not so with the bomber. The bomber, had been used, but not to bomb, but to fly around the world. So when you realize that they designed it, it was the first time they designed and used the bunker buster bomb. That is really a statement. Furthermore, you mentioned they dropped the bombs down air shafts. The air shafts had been covered up, because of the rhetoric that Trump was using in the days before. The Iranians put concrete caps on the Fordo facility, so you couldn't see the air shafts. But I guess it was the Israelis blew off the caps. So by the time the B-52s got there, there were no caps, and they could see the shafts, and they could drop the bombs right down those shafts. Now that was pretty slick intelligence and operation. But I want to know what you think of the weapons, the way they were deployed. I want to know what you think of the way we ramped this up. This is delicate because we violated somebody's sovereignty. We assassinated leaders, military and civilian. And you're opening Pandora's box when you sort of do that kind of thing. So I want to know what you think about whether we might have done it differently or better. And then, of course, there's been all this play about how much of the confidential memorandum should be released even to Congress. about the findings over the level of destruction, and that's not over. That's in play, every day here in the newspaper. So, I guess my question to you is, what did we learn that would help us do it better next time? Shackley?
Well, one thing I would point out is that Israel pretty rapidly destroyed all the air defenses of Iran. And that's why it was able to establish air superiority, which we were the beneficiary of when the B-2s came in. My understanding is that their air defense forces were all using equipment that was based on or supplied by Russia and China. And yet Israel did away with them pretty quickly. So that I think, enhances the deterrence effect as well when both those countries look on and see that their equipment didn't help very much.
What would we have done differently? And this whole scenario may play out again because they have sworn to resume their atomic efforts. They have said, or they are about to say, that the United Nations monitors cannot come in the country again. They've made it plain to the hundreds of thousands of Iranians who have demonstrated in favor of the Iran government on this in the streets of Tehran, that they're going to do it again. And Lord knows what they would do in terms of proxy terrorist groups around the Middle East and elsewhere, including possibly the United States. What do we do better the next time? Mike?
I think following up what we just did is a limited, very powerful response. If they're going to start it up again, I think there's going to be a response again, and it's going to be again overwhelming, and it's going to be limited because we're not going to have boots on the ground. So I'd say woe be to them if that's more than rhetoric. If it's just rhetoric, I expect that from Iran. That's their mantra. As they say a lot, but are they going to really ramp back up again and be a belligerent? I have some doubts about that, but time will tell. But the master stroke here was how limited and how quick our destruction of their nuclear weapon system was. Just so, and then following on what Shackley was talking about, imagine sending all those B-52s. I have been in the air in a fighter jet being refueled in the air. It's not a simple thing. You flying there, and there's a tanker above you, and you've got to get that refueling line into your receptacle. It is not an easy thing with the wind blowing around and you got two planes moving. Now you've got 7 planes, and then they have fighter planes that are supporting them. Once they get east over there in Europe, putting all of that together and being able to do that, and then have another 15 hours back, several refuelings. That's a masterful thing that we've demonstrated in our capability. And again, Russia and China are going to look at that really carefully.
Shackley, what would you say on what we have learned, how we might do it again better?
Well, one thing I'd like to point out is, as far as we know, Israel didn't lose any aircraft. That's pretty astonishing. Even just from an operational point of view, they've been at war for more than a year, actively using the Air Force to bomb Hamas and Hezbollah, and yet they were able to take on this 12-day enormous. They launched. I forget. I have the numbers here. It's like they launched 200 jets in 5 waves on the first day, delivering 330 munitions on 100 different targets, and there's estimates that the total number of attacks in the 12 days was 1,000 separate attacks on Iran that the Israelis were able to carry out successfully. Now, as far as what's next, I think that the Iranians are figuring there's not going to be any boots on the ground. Air attacks have a limited utility in the long run. they've shown that they're pretty clever at building these enormous underground facilities, and they have the intent and the determination to do that. That I'm sure that thinking still exists, and they're probably also thinking that if they just outlast Trump, whoever follows him will not be as decisive, and they'll be able to get on with their nuclear project. And so the only real solution is that Islamic regime has to go somehow.
Couple of thoughts. One is you've both said that there will never be boots on the ground. And from an American political point of view, at least in recent years, every president had said there's not going to be any boots on the ground. But from a military point of view, you wonder that ultimately, if you want to achieve regime change, if you want to, command unconditional surrender, such as was discussed, you may have to have boots on the ground. What are your thoughts about that? Will there come a time when boots on the ground becomes a more robust discussion?
I would say no. If you look at the map of Iran, it's twice the size of Texas, and it's very mountainous. It would be very, very difficult for boots on the ground to control that country. I don't know if Mike feels the same way, but there's a reason we were glad we didn't have to invade Japan.
I don't see that possibly happening. The Middle East is in a much better place today than it was 2 weeks ago, and I hope that continues. And if the Iranian regime does more than just rhetoric, which they're good at, then I think they're going to suffer more defeats in the future, and it's going to be easier. It's going to be easier to come back at them in the future than it was 2 weeks ago when Israel started this.
This Iranian war is sort of like Ukraine, because Ukraine is a small group. It has a smaller army than Russia, and yet, as Shackley said, this shows you that a small army like Israel can be clever and can take on a much larger neighboring state, a rogue state indeed. But I just wonder where that all goes, because if you have regime change, if you have unconditional surrender, if you have the end of the regime, in many cases you wind up with chaos, and chaos leads to violence and more repression. Somebody else comes up from the underside and they're worse. What about that possibility? I'm not talking about boots on the ground. I'm talking about getting into Iran to be sure that we don't have a repeat of a repressive theocracy.
But how are you going to do that? I mean, Israel already has a lot on its hands with the Palestinians. What are they going to do about that?
You're right, Jay, that many times you have a regime change and you get something worse. I've even seen people suggest that if Putin were killed or died, so the person that replaces him may be worse than Putin. So you never know. But it all is going to come down to what the country hopefully wants and is able to achieve in the country. It's not going to happen externally. It's going to happen internally. So there's either going to be either a revolution, a coup, a collapse, a combination of the both. And then you have sort of a Syrian situation where you've got factions fighting among each other. And out of that chaos, we just have to hope that the people are able to come together and develop some kind of a regime like a democracy where you have freedom, and which is what everybody wants. Everybody well, as I say, there's 80 to 90% of the public have a thirst for freedom. They love America. They want to get rid of this regime. So you're going to have to get to some kind of a coalescence of events that's going to make this regime go away. And it could happen overnight. My Iranian friends just think it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time.
I've heard a lot of people say that, just a matter of time, because there is a resistance there. They've been repressive for so long and they have, conducted crimes against their own people for so long that
Yeah.
it will bubble up. But let me offer you this thought. We talked about how a small nation acting in a clever fashion can prevail over a larger, more well-armed nation. But part of that, I think, and it's been demonstrated here in this war with Iran, that technology plays a big part. And although we don't know all the details just yet, it's clear that you have two wings of B-52 bombers flying opposite points of the world. One wing flew west, one wing flew east, and it's part of a fake out. And nobody knew exactly where they were going. They did not announce it, but they had the technology to refuel in the air. They had the technology to find their targets, and the technology of the bumper buster bomb. That is really something. And I'm sure that's not the end of it. We don't know all the fantastic technology that went into achieving this mission. The other thing is, and this, part of a war where you don't have boots on the ground, you can't necessarily, short of intelligence and operatives, in the other country, you really don't have a lot of control about what goes on there. But part of a war now, it's changed. It makes it clear that it's changed. Is a war of propaganda. It's a war of rhetoric. It's a war of how you ramp up on what you say at the time you conduct the operation and what you say after it. Do you agree that this redefines this kind of war? That it's a matter of technology, of being way ahead of the other guy. I guess intelligence is part of that. And it's a matter of propaganda, rhetoric, public statements.
The Ukraine sort of proved that initially, because everyone thought that Russia would roll over Ukraine in a couple of days, and the Ukrainians, through being clever and innovative, have transformed warfare with their drone technology, which just seems to be getting better and better, and having more and more capabilities. I noticed that the regime cut off the internet. That was one of the first things they did when the war started, and it's possible that if they had access to Starlink and other communication technologies, which is probably going to happen at some point, then the ideas from the outside and the encouragement to seek change in their society will be greater and greater, and that may help. And ideas are what cause change, right? And apparently they're already thinking in that direction.
I think also there's a Churchillian level of disinformation or manipulation of information throughout this campaign. Right up before the Israelis launched their attack, we were signaling to Iran that we're ready to go back in and talk. And then all of a sudden, Israel launches its attack. So they were lulling them. And Israel lulled the leaders that they bombed into a room where they destroyed them. And right up until the time, if you remember, Trump said that I'm giving you 2 weeks. Of course, Khomeini basically came back and said, I'm not going to negotiate anything. So the next day, we launch our attack, or 2 days after. So there was a lot of disinformation being put out there to deceive Iran as to our intentions. And then we wound up doing something I think they got blindsided in many cases.
One of the concerns, I think, was if we don't stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon, and it gets a nuclear weapon, then the other nations in the area, the Gulf states and the Arab states, are going to feel compelled to develop nuclear weapons themselves for their own self-protection, because no one else is obviously going to protect them. That's probably the way they would think about it. And so by destroying the nuclear capability of the Iranians, we take that pressure off. And if you couple that with the Abraham Accords and the effort to normalize business and political relations between Israel and the Gulf states and the Arab states, those are pressures that can eventually also assist in the changes in Iran, as long as we can keep them from having those nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And the whole question of alliances and talking with allies and all this is very important. Either you talk to them and get their support, and then you have a combined effort, or you don't talk to them at all and you protect the secrecy of your mission. This is a difficult issue. But the other issue that comes out of it, and you both referred to it, is the notion, the effort of trying to have, quote, negotiations, end quote. And both you guys are lawyers. One's a judge, one's attorney general. You've seen wars in court, litigation galore, and you know how many games there are to play about using negotiated settlement discussions as a way to enhance your position in what is a litigation war. So what are your thoughts about that? I mean, this was always a possibility. Trump started his efforts at what do you want to call it? Negotiating the restoration of the Obama nuclear deal with Iran when he was first in office. I mean, in this term, and that didn't go anywhere. But query, what have we learned about that? How useful is it? How effective is it? How effective can it be? Should it be? Would it be in going forward? Or is it a non-starter and who cares?
One of the things I learned as a lawyer is there used to be lawyers in Hawaii that would say, you never make the first offer. You never call the other side in litigation. You wait for them to call you because then you're in a position of strength. And I realized over time that that's crazy, because the sooner you start talking to people, the sooner you'll have a settlement. And so that's what I did ever after that. And I think it's the same thing here. And that's what Trump does. That's why he's always trying to talk to people. And he does. And when he says, oh, well, I know Mr. Putin well, he's a great guy, blah, I'm sure he doesn't actually think that. But he says it because that's part of opening the lines of communication. And I think that is very effective, I think.
It's all game theory, and in negotiations, it's all a matter of risk and benefit on both sides. And I think Iran knows right now what the risk is. So in going in a negotiation, they have to weigh that against what's the ultimate benefit for them if they're not willing to negotiate and achieve an outcome. So Trump's certainly followed Teddy Roosevelt's carry a big stick, talk softly, but I don't know how softly, but carry a big stick, and they've learned what the risk is, and so I've always found that when people want to negotiate, want a resolution, you'll get one. And if they don't, you don't get a resolution.
Sometimes when they say they want to negotiate, they don't. And they're using it as a strategy, but not a sincere effort.
But as long as you're talking, you always find out something about the other side. That's the thing. You always gain information and intelligence that you can consider and use to make your own decisions as you go along. That's why it's really important to keep the communications open, even if the other side is intransigent.
One other point we should discuss is the threat that Iran made to take countermeasures, their own countermeasures, for example, to close the Strait of Hormuz, and also, for example, to attack the United States through various terror possibilities. And this is of concern. Are we prepared for that? Going forward, we really have to take that seriously, I think. But are we ready for it? Is there something we can learn from what happened to make us safer, not only in global oil supply in the Strait of Hormuz, but also at home here to defend ourselves against terror attacks in the United States?
The threat of closing the Hormuz is just saber rattling. It's like cutting off your nose. Their oil exports go out of there. Most of it goes to China. China doesn't want that. So whatever influence China has is going to be against them doing something like that, and they haven't done it yet. And then it's a question: can they really? They don't really have a navy. Can they really do that? I, I question that.
One of the things I thought was, as the engagement progressed, Iran did launch some pretty impressive missiles that the Israelis were having trouble dealing with. And I remember thinking when I saw those missiles, they looked pretty sophisticated, like an ICBM. And I thought, boy, if they had a nuclear weapon, they definitely would have used it with one of those missiles. And they might even use it on us. So we really need to make sure we keep our keep the lid on their nuclear ambitions, because they just simply can't be trusted.
You talk about the missiles, and you talk about their missile attacks on Israel. They were more effective this time than they have been in the past. And you've seen the news. There were a number of successful strikes against Haifa and Tel Aviv. And so Iron Dome did not catch them all. And I would expect that the U.S. was supporting the replenishment of ammunition and the like for Iron Dome, but it really didn't work as well as before. The damage that Israel took and the deaths that Israel took as a result of their retaliation, the Iranian retaliation, was greater than in any war in the past. And I don't know what we do about that. We can't let that happen again and again. Your thoughts about what the U.S. could do to prevent, to enhance Iron Dome, enhance Israeli defenses, and what Israel can do.
One of the things about their launching those ballistic missiles into Israel, that none of them were strategic missiles. They were hitting the people. They weren't taking out anything militarily significant, anything that could alter the war, other than to inflict damage on people. From a tactically, yeah, they caused a lot of damage, but strategically, it didn't change the dynamics. But getting back to what Shackley said, this just demonstrates in spades why Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, because it could very likely put it on one of those missiles, or several of them, and we can't stop them all, and something's going to get through, and Israel's going to get wiped out, which is what Iran's stated mission has been for the last 49 years.
If they did get a nuclear warhead and they launched it at Israel and destroyed Israel, that's the majority of the Jewish people, right?
Several million. Another Holocaust is what would happen.
Yeah.
The hatred is not going to go away. That's been Iran has made no bones about what they feel about Israel and Jews, and as far as they're concerned, they want to wipe them out, and that's not going to change as long as that regime remains the same.
I wouldn't make a bet on this, but it's likely that they will continue, that the theocracy will continue, that there won't be regime change. Let's assume that for this discussion, hypothetically. And so, looking down the road for a few years, we see a continuation of the same anti-Israeli, anti-American sentiment in Iran, and we see the continuation of those military organizations and their missile arsenal, which they probably get from China, a large part. And so here we are, and at some point, and I don't know when, but at some point, we here in the United States will have a regime change. Now, to the extent that this was a successful operation, you have to credit Trump with it, Trump and the military under Trump. I believe there are things that we might have done differently, but there's nothing like success. And it was, at least in the scope of it, it was successful. If we had another government, perhaps a government that was more tolerant, a government that probably would be, or that possibly would be more interested in, may I use the Munich term, appeasement, we might have a different state of affairs. And so I wonder if the notions that we've been discussing today, if the need to stop the proliferation of atomic weaponry in Iran is primary. The query in a democracy where there is succession And we've seen that sometimes succession can be good, sometimes it can be bad. If we had a succession to a less aggressive, administration, well, we have a detriment. We have a disadvantage, don't you think?
The motto "Peace through Strength" was the motto of the Seventh Fleet when I was in the Vietnam War, and as long as we maintain our moral strength, our military as a backdrop is going to be fine. But if we lose that, then all bets are off.
Can I add this? When I was a judge, we had a situation where a man had threatened to kill his wife, and he was released for some reason. He went home and he promptly killed his wife. He stabbed her to death in the shower, just like in the movie Psycho. And ever after that, if a person issues a threat, I take them at face value and I believe what they say. And when Iran says death to America, death to Israel, we need to take that at face value and do what's necessary to make sure that they never are capable or have the opportunity to do that. And it's as simple as that. Now, you're right. There may be administrations that are not as decisive, and that could be a real problem in the future. But we've sort of set a precedent here. Hopefully, the successors to the Trump administration, whoever they are, will see what was done and realize that it worked.
Okay, what about the notion of breaching sovereignty? What about the notion of assassinating leaders and military people across borders? Is Pandora's box open on that now?
Well, we opened it when we shot down Yamamoto in 1944 down in the Solomons. I say that my dad, who's a retired Navy captain and World War II veteran, he never thought that was we shouldn't be assassinating other leaders, so he wasn't in favor of that. But Nimitz approved it, probably with some reluctance. And so, personally, I have some concerns about going out and assassinate because if you target other leaders, then your leaders are going to be targeted. And as we know, Iran has called for the assassination of our president. And I don't know to what extent they've got anybody out there that's willing to do that, but that's the two-edged sword of assassinations. On the other hand, taking out Soleimani and taking out these military leaders in Iran is a real wake-up call for Iran.
Yeah. Shackley, anything?
Well, I thought that the Israeli killing of the atomic scientists and the leaders of the IRGC, that's sort of what you're talking about. I think they even tried to get Khomeini, didn't they? But they failed because he was.
No, they said we know where he is.
Oh,
and they could.
The danger is so great. I think I would make an exception.
But I was going to ask.
I understand what they say, but we have to be nice. We can't do that because they might try to do. But yeah, but the guy said he's going to kill his wife. What are you going to do?
I have to
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. As my Iranian friend said, the biggest mistake Israel made was not taking out Khomeini.
Yeah. I was going to ask you guys if you would provide your final thoughts here today, the thoughts you would leave with our viewers. But I would like to shape that a little and to ask you also to include, and this is a more difficult question, what is going to happen now? That's a hard one because it calls for all kinds of speculation. But Mike, why don't you go first? What are your thoughts that you would leave with our viewers, and what do you think is going to happen here?
I think there's a great opportunity for peace and prosperity in the Middle East that we haven't seen in generations. There's a potential here that the belligerence and the terror and what the countries in the Middle East have been facing have a silver lining, and it's going to have some great prosperity for everybody. My Iranian friend said, if Iran opened up, there are 10 million Iranians around the world, and they would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars into Iran to become a very prosperous country that it once was. So there's this great opportunity that we're facing. On the other hand, there's also a cliff there, and if things go awry, it could devolve into even more chaos. So that's the two-edged sword of what we're facing. We're facing either great prosperity or more of the same, and maybe worse.
Shackley, your thoughts?
I would just add that I think the Arab world now, that's I'm sure looking very carefully at this, as well as the Russians and the Chinese, have been impressed with the decisiveness and the success of both Israel and especially the United States. And I think that kind of creates a umbrella of opportunity in the Middle East, so long as we follow through and make sure that Iran doesn't resume its activities and both in terms of supporting terrorism and renewing its nuclear project, that this opens up opportunities for collaboration and peace between Israel and the rest of the nations in the Middle East, and that coupled with keeping the lid on Iran and the Islamic regime there, could lead to a whole new era of prosperity and success, in the Middle East, and that would be wonderful. Think of how many years there's been strife and killing and extremism in the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in incredible savagery, and this is an opportunity to maybe draw that to a close through the leadership and decisiveness of Israel and the United States. And if people believe that, if they believe in us, then we can maybe move all forward and have a much more peaceful and successful Middle East. That's what I hope for.
Yeah, that's why this war, this event, this episode only a few days ago, is an inflection point for the U.S. politically, for Europe, and certainly for the Middle East. And here we are at another historic inflection point. I can only guarantee you one thing: there will be more inflection points coming forward.
May you live in interesting times, right?
Yes.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much to our guests, Shackley, Raffetto, and Mike Lilly. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections, in this episode, which we are calling What Have We Learned from the War with Iran? Thanks to our listeners for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, you guys.
Aloha. Thank you, Jay.